The American Civil War, the birth of modern industrial warfare. The Civil War didn't just change America, it proved the future of war would belong to industry, not heroes. For thousands of years, war was ultimately decided by people, not machines, not factories, not supply chains. Victory depended on leadership, courage, discipline, and sometimes pure chance. Armies marched into battle believing that bravery, training, and tactical brilliance would decide who lived and who ruled. From the disciplined legions of Rome to the knightly charges of medieval Europe, from the musket lines of the 1700s to the mass armies of Napoleon, the fundamental logic of war stayed surprisingly consistent. Weapons improved slowly. Communication remained slow. Armies still needed to see their enemy to defeat them. Even when firearms became widespread, warfare remained deeply human in scale. Muskets were inaccurate. Artillery was dangerous but imprecise. Battles still required armies to move close enough to see the enemy's faces. Officers believed discipline and morale mattered more than technology. By the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte had perfected what many believed was the ultimate form of warfare: fast movement, decisive battles, concentrated force, and strong leadership. His campaigns reshaped Europe and convinced military thinkers that future wars would be short, decisive, and shaped by brilliant commanders. For decades after Napoleon, European wars seemed to confirm this belief. Conflicts like the Austro-Prussian War and Franco-Prussian War ended quickly. The idea of the decisive battle became military doctrine. War, in the public imagination, was still heroic. Young men believed they would march to glory. Politicians believed wars could be controlled. Generals believed maneuver and courage would always overcome firepower. Then, quietly, society began to change. The Industrial Revolution was transforming how nations worked and how they would fight. Factories could now produce weapons faster than ever before. Railroads connected entire countries. Telegraph lines allowed communication across vast distances almost instantly. But most military leaders did not fully understand what this meant. Technology was advancing faster than military thinking. When the American Civil War began in 1861, both sides expected a short war. Many soldiers believed they would be home within months. Civilians cheered armies marching to battle, believing the war would produce heroes and decisive victories. Early battles looked exactly like earlier European wars. Soldiers fought in formations. Officers ordered direct assaults. Cavalry still played major roles. But beneath this familiar appearance, something fundamental had changed. The weapons were different. Rifled muskets allowed soldiers to hit targets hundreds of meters away with deadly accuracy. Artillery became more precise and more destructive. Defensive positions became dramatically stronger than offensive tactics. The battlefield was becoming more lethal, but commanders were still using old ideas. The results were catastrophic. At battles like Antietam and Gettysburg, casualty numbers shocked the world. Thousands died in single days. Entire units were destroyed in minutes. Charges that once decided battles now became suicide missions. Soldiers began digging trenches, not as planned strategy, but as survival instinct. The Civil War was revealing something terrifying. Technology had outpaced tradition. Industrial society had outpaced heroic warfare. And for the first time in modern history, war was beginning to move beyond the control of individual courage or brilliant generals. The scale of killing was no longer limited by how many soldiers could fight. It was limited by how much a nation could produce. Factories replaced workshops, railroads replaced horse supply lines, telegraphs replaced couriers. Entire societies began feeding the battlefield with resources, manpower, and production. The American Civil War was no longer just a war between two armies. It was becoming the first war between two industrial societies. And the world was watching, even if it did not yet understand what it was seeing. Because what was happening in America was not just a national tragedy, it was a preview of the future. A future where wars would be decided not only by soldiers on battlefields, but by factories, engineers, rail networks, and entire economic systems working together. When industry entered the battlefield. If Section 1 was about the death of purely heroic warfare, Section 2 is about the birth of something far more powerful and far more terrifying. The American Civil War was the first conflict where industrial society did not just support war, it became war. For the first time in modern history, victory depended not only on battlefield tactics, but on which nation could produce more, move faster, and sustain destruction longer. One of the clearest examples of this transformation was the railroad. Before railroads, armies moved at the speed of marching soldiers and horses. Supply lines were fragile. Reinforcements could take weeks or months to arrive. Wars were limited by geography and logistics. Railroads changed all of that. During the Civil War, both the Union and Confederacy used rail networks to move entire armies across hundreds of miles in days. Supplies could reach front lines continuously. Food, ammunition, replacement weapons, and reinforcements could flow into battle zones with unprecedented speed. But the North had a decisive advantage. The Union controlled the majority of America's rail infrastructure and industrial production. Northern factories could produce weapons, uniforms, artillery shells, and equipment in massive quantities. When losses occurred, they could be replaced. The Confederacy, by contrast, struggled to maintain production. Its economy was less industrialized, and its rail network was smaller and harder to maintain under wartime pressure. The Civil War was proving something new. Industrial capacity was becoming as important as military skill. Then came the telegraph. Before the telegraph, communication in war depended on messengers riding horses. Orders could take hours or days to arrive. Miscommunication was common. Commanders often fought battles with incomplete information. The telegraph changed war into something closer to modern command systems. Governments could communicate directly with generals in the field. Armies could coordinate movements across entire regions. Strategic planning could happen in near real time. This created something new: centralized war planning at a national level. War was no longer just generals making decisions on battlefields. It became governments directing entire war efforts. Factories became as important as fortresses. Industrial production meant armies could be supplied continuously, but it also meant wars could last longer. Nations no longer needed to win quickly. They could endure losses and rebuild armies. This led to something historians now call industrial attrition warfare, where victory comes from outlasting the enemy's ability to replace men, weapons, and supplies. The Civil War became a test of endurance. Even medicine became industrialized. Rail systems evacuated wounded soldiers faster. Organized medical corps began emerging at large scale. Mass casualty treatment became part of war planning for the first time. Engineering also transformed warfare. Military engineers built bridges quickly to maintain army movement. They constructed fortifications faster. They built rail repair units to keep supply networks alive, even under attack. War was becoming a system, not just a series of battles. But industrial war also changed how civilians experienced conflict. Factories became targets. Railroads became strategic objectives. Cities became logistical centers. Entire populations became indirectly part of the war effort. This was the early form of what later historians would call total war, where the line between civilian and military support begins to blur. The Civil War was not total war in the full 20th century, but it was a major step toward it. Foreign observers noticed these changes. European military officers were sent to observe Civil War battles. Some studied railroad logistics, others studied mass mobilization. Some noticed trench systems and defensive warfare becoming dominant. But many European leaders made a dangerous assumption. They believed America was unique. They believed Europe's professional armies, shorter wars, and different geography would prevent industrial stalemate warfare from happening there. They believed future wars would still be fast. They believed offensive spirit and maneuver would always defeat defensive firepower. But the battlefield math was changing. If weapons could kill faster than soldiers could move, if factories could replace weapons faster than armies could destroy them, if railroads could feed armies continuously, then wars would no longer be short. They would become contests of national strength. The Civil War showed that a nation's economy, industry, and infrastructure could determine victory long before the final battle was fought. And this idea was revolutionary. It meant war was no longer just about military training or heroic leadership. It was about which society could organize production, technology, transportation, and manpower into one unified war system. The American Civil War was teaching the world a lesson most would ignore. And decades later, in the trenches of World War I, millions would pay the price for that mistake. The birth of trench warfare and industrial killing. If industrial production changed how wars were supplied, defensive technology changed how wars were fought and how soldiers experienced battle itself. By the middle years of the American Civil War, something shocking was happening on battlefields. Armies were no longer moving freely across open terrain. Instead, they were digging into the earth. At first, trenches were temporary. Soldiers dug shallow earthworks during pauses in fighting. But as the war continued, trenches became deeper, longer, and more complex. What began as simple protection slowly evolved into entire defensive systems. This change was not theoretical. It was driven by survival. Rifled muskets dramatically increased battlefield lethality. A trained soldier could hit targets at ranges that previously would have been impossible. Artillery also became more precise and destructive. Shell fragmentation, improved fuses, and better aiming methods made defensive positions deadly zones for attackers. The traditional logic of warfare began to collapse. For centuries, armies believed offensive action decided wars. Charging the enemy, breaking lines, and forcing retreat had defined victory. But now, attacking forces often suffered devastating losses before even reaching defensive lines. The battlefield was becoming mathematically unforgiving. If defenders could fire accurately from cover, if artillery could strike advancing formations at distance, if reinforcements and ammunition could be supplied continuously through rail and industrial production, then attacking became vastly more expensive in lives. One of the clearest examples of this transformation came during the Siege of Petersburg in 1864 to 1865. At Petersburg, Union and Confederate forces dug massive trench networks stretching for miles. Soldiers lived underground for months. Sniper fire, artillery bombardment, and constant skirmishing created a battlefield environment that looked shockingly similar to what Europe would experience 50 years later during World War I. Even underground warfare appeared. Union forces famously attempted to break Confederate lines by digging a tunnel beneath enemy positions and detonating explosives, creating the massive crater that still exists today. The explosion itself was devastating, but the failed assault afterward showed something new and terrifying. Even dramatic technological attacks could fail against prepared defensive systems. Petersburg was not just a siege, it was a preview of industrialized positional warfare. Soldiers began to experience war not as moments of dramatic battle, but as constant exposure to danger. Shelling could happen at any time. Snipers could strike without warning. Disease, exhaustion, and psychological stress became constant companions. War was becoming less about human decision and more about surviving systems of destruction. This transformation also changed military planning. Commanders began to understand that battles might no longer be decided in days. Instead, wars could become grinding struggles where progress was measured in meters, not miles. And behind the trenches, another reality was becoming clear. The side that could supply ammunition, food, medical care, and reinforcements consistently would eventually win. The Union's industrial strength began to show its full power. Northern factories continued producing weapons and supplies. Northern railroads continued delivering resources. The Union could absorb losses and rebuild. The Confederacy, despite tactical brilliance and determined resistance, struggled against this industrial imbalance. Shortages became common. Equipment became harder to replace. Transportation networks became fragile under constant pressure. The Civil War was proving something brutal and simple. Industrial strength could defeat battlefield brilliance. This was not to say leadership and tactics no longer mattered. They still shaped battles and campaigns, but they increasingly operated inside larger systems of production, logistics, and infrastructure. The Civil War also revealed another psychological transformation. For soldiers, war became less about glory and more about endurance. The romantic image of battlefield heroism began to collide with the reality of industrial slaughter. Letters from soldiers increasingly described exhaustion, fear, and monotony. Long periods of waiting were broken by sudden, overwhelming violence. War became less predictable and more mechanical. And this was perhaps the most disturbing change of all. War was becoming less human. Not because soldiers mattered less, but because systems of production and technology now controlled how wars unfolded. Individual bravery could still matter locally, but it could not overcome industrial-scale destruction. Observers from Europe saw parts of this transformation. Some understood the warning signs. Some wrote reports about trench systems, industrial supply chains, and defensive dominance. But many believed these conditions were unique to America's geography and political structure. They believed Europe would never fight this way. They believed future wars would still be fast. But the Civil War had already shown the future. A future where armies would dig into the earth. A future where factories would feed endless battle lines. A future where war would become a test of entire societies. And when World War I began in 1914, that future would arrive, almost exactly as the American Civil War had predicted. Why the world ignored the warning. If the American Civil War revealed the future of warfare, one question remains unavoidable. Why didn't the world listen? The tragedy is not that the Civil War failed to produce lessons. The tragedy is that many nations saw those lessons and chose to believe they did not apply to them. After the war ended in 1865, military observers returned to Europe, carrying reports, field notes, and first-hand experience. British, French, Prussian, Russian, and Austrian officers had watched industrial war unfold in real time. Some understood what they had witnessed. They saw how railroads could move armies faster than any previous system. They saw how industrial production allowed nations to replace losses continuously. They saw how defensive firepower could stop traditional offensive tactics. They saw how entire societies were being mobilized to support war. But military institutions rarely change quickly. Most European armies were built around traditions stretching back centuries. Officer classes shaped by aristocratic culture. Military doctrine focused on maneuver, offensive spirit, and decisive battle. The Civil War did not fit comfortably into these beliefs. so many leaders explained it away. Some argued America's geography forced trench warfare. Some claimed American armies lacked professional discipline. Some believed European wars would always remain limited and controlled. But beneath these rationalizations were deeper reasons. Industrial war meant mass mobilization. It meant massive economic cost. It meant entire societies being reshaped for war production. Governments worried that preparing for long industrial wars would disrupt social stability and economic growth. There was also a powerful psychological factor. The late 1800s was a period of relative European stability compared to earlier centuries. After the devastation of the Napoleonic Wars, European powers preferred short conflicts with limited goals. Wars like the Franco-Prussian War seemed to confirm that decisive, fast wars were still possible. This created a dangerous illusion. Military planners began designing strategies based on speed and offensive momentum. Plans like Germany's Schlieffen Plan were built on the assumption that future wars had to be won quickly, before industrial attrition could take hold. Few leaders wanted to imagine a war lasting years. Few wanted to imagine millions dying. But the warning signs were everywhere. New machine guns increased defensive firepower even further. Heavy artillery became more destructive. National industrial production kept expanding. Rail networks became denser and more efficient. Every technological trend pointed toward longer, more destructive wars. Yet military culture still valued attack over defense. Many commanders believed morale and aggression could overcome technology. Soldiers were trained to advance, to charge, to break enemy lines through determination and discipline. Then came 1914. When World War I began, most governments expected a short war. Soldiers marched to the front believing they would return home within months. Civilians celebrated mobilization as if it were a national adventure. Then industrial reality took over. Machine guns cut down attacking soldiers in seconds. Artillery bombardments reshaped entire landscapes. Railroads kept feeding new troops into battle. Factories produced weapons at industrial scale. Within months, trench lines stretched across hundreds of miles, exactly like the systems first seen in the American Civil War. The result was catastrophic. Millions died in a war few had planned for, and even fewer understood. Generals tried to break trench stalemates with massive offensives that cost hundreds of thousands of lives for minimal gains. The Civil War had already shown this could happen. But belief in short wars, offensive spirit, and decisive maneuver proved stronger than historical warning. There was also another uncomfortable truth. Industrial war reduces the power of individual leadership. It shifts power towards systems, production, logistics, technology, and national organization. For many military and political leaders, this was difficult to accept. Heroic war is easier to imagine. Industrial war is harder to control. By the time World War I ended, the world finally understood what the Civil War had revealed decades earlier. War was no longer limited by bravery. It was limited by industrial capacity. The cost of ignoring that lesson reshaped the entire 20th century. Empires collapsed, economies were destroyed, political revolutions spread across continents, and the global balance of power shifted permanently. The American Civil War was not just a national conflict, it was a warning shot for the modern world. And history proved that ignoring warnings can be more deadly than not seeing them at all. The modern world. War belongs to systems. If the American Civil War revealed the beginning of industrial warfare, the next century proved that this transformation was permanent. By the time World War I ended, the world had learned, through unimaginable loss, that modern war was no longer about single battles or individual generals. It was about national systems competing against each other.
World War II pushed this reality even further. Industrial production did not just support war, it became the central battlefield. Entire economies were reorganized around military output. Factories produced tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition at scales never seen before. Nations competed not only on battlefields, but in shipyards, assembly lines, and research laboratories. Technology accelerated this transformation. Radar systems changed air warfare. Code breaking changed intelligence. Strategic bombing targeted industrial infrastructure directly. War had fully expanded beyond soldiers and battlefields into entire national systems. Then came the Cold War. For the first time in history, war between major powers became less about direct battlefield combat and more about technological, industrial, and economic competition. Nuclear weapons made direct large-scale war between superpowers potentially catastrophic. Instead, nations competed through industrial development, scientific research, space technology, and economic influence. The Cold War proved something the Civil War had first suggested. The strongest war systems might win without fighting major direct battles at all. Today, the logic of industrial warfare has evolved into something even more complex. Modern warfare is shaped by networks, technological networks, supply networks, data networks, and energy networks. Satellites guide weapons across continents. Cyber operations can disrupt power grids, communications, and financial systems. Artificial intelligence is beginning to influence targeting, logistics, and battlefield decision-making. The modern battlefield is no longer just physical. It is digital, it is economic, it is technological. Nations now compete constantly, not only during wars, but during peace. Industrial capacity, semiconductor production, energy independence, data infrastructure, and technological innovation all shape military power long before conflicts begin. And yet, despite all this change, one idea from earlier centuries still survives: the idea of heroic warfare. Movies, books, and national myths still focus on individual bravery and battlefield moments. And individual courage still matters. Soldiers still risk their lives, still make decisions that shape battles, still carry the human cost of war.
But modern wars are decided long before soldiers meet each other. They are decided in research laboratories, in factories, in supply chains, in energy production systems, in technological innovation. The American Civil War was not the first industrial conflict in history, but it was the first war to clearly show what industrial warfare would become. It showed that modern war would not be short. It showed that modern war would not be purely heroic. It showed that modern war would belong to nations that could organize entire societies for sustained conflict. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that once industrial warfare begins, it is incredibly difficult to stop quickly. That lesson still matters today. Modern conflicts may look different on the surface: drones instead of cavalry, satellites instead of signal flags, cyber attacks instead of sabotage teams. But the underlying logic remains the same. War follows society. As societies become more technological, more interconnected, and more industrially complex, war evolves alongside them. The Civil War marked the moment when humanity crossed from the age of heroic warfare into the age of systemic warfare. It did not end heroism. It did not end battlefield leadership. But it changed the foundation of how wars are fought and won. And that transformation continues today. The world we live in, where power depends on production, technology, infrastructure, and systems, was born in the smoke, mud, and iron of the American Civil War. The soldiers who fought it may not have known it. The leaders who commanded it may not have fully understood it. But history remembers it, because in that conflict, the world saw the future of war for the first time. And once that future arrived, there was no going back.